This chapter is one of the most underrated proper use of the word low-key important chapters in the book, because within the book itself, Dostoevsky seems to already have an eye to the future, how people will interpret his book, how people will misinterpret his book, how people should interpret his book. So within the book itself, we already have an interpretation of the story, and that's one of the beauties of this anticlimactic 12th book, is that we get to look back on the first 11 books and offer some interpretation before we're even done with the entire book. And so the prosecutor, his words are not to be trifled with. Dostoevsky, the narrator, paints us as this is a man who is seeing self-consciously this interpretation of the Karamazov family as his swan song, as his life's work. And the narrator informs us that in fact it was his swan song. Maybe he had some premonition of his own death, and that he is not just absolutely convinced of his interpretation of the family or the trial, but as a symbol of all of Russia at the time. So this is a really important speech that the narrator / Dostoevsky wants us to really pay attention to, not just in the world of the novel, but as a real statement on Russia itself. That whatever this guy, this prosecutor believes, he believes it sincerely, and he's saying it as his swan song, as he is going to be put to death. And so he looks at Russia as a whole, first of all. And by the way, this seems to have very little to do with the trial. That is explicitly said at the end of his speech here in this chapter. But let's allow Dostoevsky some room to play here. So first of all, Russia should have a lukewarm indifference to this trial, because in the real world, the Tsar has had assassination attempts. There are real terrorist actions going on. And so much like being an American in 2025, it really takes a lot to shock you, because your news feed and your television sets and your phone are informing you of horrific stuff on a daily basis. And so Russia, at the time of the prosecutor's speech, is sort of in the same condition, where there's so much bad that people are lukewarm to something that people should be shocked and offended by. And what about the youth? What about not just the present, but the future of Russia? Well, young people are turning to suicide, and they're not even considering Hamlet's question. They're not even considering whether to be or not to be. They're assuming that they know that the answer to the question, that there's nothing after this life. And when you conclude that there's nothing after this life, then suicide makes a little bit more sense. Well, then he starts to talk about the trial and says, listen, while I'm prosecuting Dmitri, I understand where he came from. I understand tragedy. I understand psychology. And what we know is that Dmitri grew up under Fyodor, and Fyodor is a sensualist. He represents a fatherhood in Russia. So people might be able to have a little bit more wisdom, not be such crass fools. But at the end of the day, fatherhood in Russia is filled with sensualists as well. And so the older generation who had values is vanishing away, and now a new generation of sensualists. And is Fyodor kind of an extreme caricature, a straw man of fatherhood? Well, yes, he is, but it's a convenient way to think about fatherhood in general. So this is why what the prosecutor is so on about. That if it was just Fyodor, you would say, that's a shame, and then you would move on. But if Fyodor symbolized a whole generation of fathers in Russia, then it would be troubling. So yes, he's worse, but he stands for people who are the same basic person and only are a little bit better, a little less shameful in the way that they go about it. Well, what about his son, Ivan? Well, he stands for the left wing, the European wing, completely abandoning your motherland and its ideas and going for a rationalistic European way of looking at things. But the prosecutor says, though Ivan has lost his mind, though he's at this fever pitch, that shows that he hasn't fully abandoned, because it wouldn't bother him if he didn't have some love for his motherland. And so the very fact that he's tormented shows that all is not lost, because the only thing worse than losing your mind is this cold indifference to things like murder and suicide. So the fact that it bothers Ivan is in fact actually a good sign, paradoxically or ironically. What about Alyosha? Well, Alyosha gets the same criticism that Dostoevsky knows he's going to get, even while he's publishing this serially. He knows what character is going to get the most brushback, and that is Alyosha. And seeing his religious striving not as some sort of success, but as falling back away from the world, as this sad attempt to be the opposite of Ivan. So Ivan is European and Alyosha is just a retreat. So really treating conservatism or a religious conservatism as sort of a sad, pitiful way of retreating from the real world and finding life in the monastery. And he says, all the best if that works for him, but I just hope he doesn't become disillusioned. So that's Dostoevsky sort of tipping his cap to the critics, getting ahead of the story and saying, I know what you're going to say, Alyosha, that he's backward, that this is a retreat, that religion and conservatism are a coping mechanism. All right, so 3 characters so far. The prosecutor has said Fyodor is a sensualist who represents the fathers of Russia. Ivan is a left-wing European who represents people who have gone to the left, the new atheism. And Alyosha is to the right, those who have stayed with the traditions and they're doing it as a coping mechanism. Well, that kind of only really leaves a couple more characters. Smerdyakov, what happens to him? Well, he's committed suicide because of Ivan's ideals. And of course, Dmitri, who in the novel and in this chapter more particularly represents Russia itself. And which abyss will Dmitri fall into? Alyosha's upward abyss or Ivan/Fyodor's downward abyss? Or, to put it in the language of the previous few chapters, is he the truth of Katerina Ivanova's first level-headed testimony or second post-Ivan histrionic or hysterical testimony? Which is true of Dmitri? And the prosecutor says, well, the problem is that it's both true. So here is the prosecutor on the Karamazov family, but Dmitri really, and how Dmitri represents all of Russia itself. As a rule, between 2 extremes, one has to find the mean. But in the present case, this is not true. The probability is that in the first case, he was genuinely noble, and in the second, as genuinely base. And why? Because he was of the broad Karamazov character. That's just what I am leading up to. Capable of combining the most incongruous contradictions and simultaneously contemplating both abysses, the abyss above us and the abyss of the highest ideals, and the abyss below us, the abyss of the lowest and foulest degradation. Remember the brilliant remark made by a young observer who had observed the Karamazov family at close quarters and profoundly. Mr. Rakitin, the sense of their own degradation is as essential to these reckless, unbridled natures as the sense of their lofty generosity. And that's true. They continually and unceasingly need this unnatural mixture. 2 extremes, gentlemen, at the same moment, or they are miserable and dissatisfied and their existence is incomplete. They are wide as Mother Russia. They include everything and put up with everything. And so the prosecutor is a psychologist, but psychology, at least in that day, Dostoevsky is saying, is really, you can put scientific in air quotes. Yes, it's helpful, but does it get to the real nature of emotions and things beyond sociology, beyond DNA and parenting? Does it take account of all human experience? No, it does not. And so the prosecutor stands in for future readers of the brothers Karamazov for Dostoevsky and saying, you can read this book with a certain interpretation, you can give it a certain reading, but if it is merely armchair psychology, if it's merely Psych 101, that blood causes you to do this or parents cause you to do X or Y, then that is really a simplistic reading of his novel. And the way that I am confident in my interpretation is the way that the prosecutor puts himself in the line of Rakitin. So if that is your major source of truth, Rakitin, then that shows that you haven't completely understood the novel. So all four of the main characters, they stand for the intellectual elite in Russia. Dostoevsky knows that each of these characters representing a different part of Russia, he knows that they're caricatures, he knows they're straw men, but sometimes seeing a caricature or seeing a straw man speaks a lot of truth to the people that they represent. And so while they are hyper-real, hyper-realized versions of the religious right, the atheist left, the sensualist, those that are governed by their emotions, the four main characters here, while they're hyper-realized versions of those characters, they do speak a lot of truth about Mother Russia. And that is why this prosecutor is so intent on this being his swan song, because it's not just about his complete belief that Dmitri is guilty, but what his guilt says about his entire nation and really the future of it.